The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens of Windsor Castle, as 10-year-old Prince George walked quietly through the stone corridors. Unlike other children his age, who might be playing video games or watching cartoons, George carried the weight of royal expectations on his young shoulders. Today felt different, though, as if something important was about to happen. The palace was buzzing with its usual activity. Staff members hurried past, carrying silver trays, their footsteps echoing against the ancient walls. Guards stood at attention in their traditional red uniforms, their faces stern and focused. George had grown up around these people, yet sometimes he felt like he lived in a different world from everyone else. As he rounded the corner near the east wing, George noticed something unusual. One of the younger guards, Thomas, was standing at his post, but something was wrong. His usually perfect posture seemed strained, and George could see his hands trembling slightly as he gripped his ceremonial rifle. George had always been curious about the people who worked in the palace. While other members of the royal family often passed by without much thought, George made it a habit to learn the names of the staff. He knew Thomas had been working at the palace for only 6 months. The young guard was 22 years old and had joined the Queen's Guard after completing his military training. Instead of walking past, as most royals would do, George slowed his pace. He pretended to examine a painting on the wall, but his real attention was on Thomas. The guard's face had turned pale, and small beads of sweat were forming on his forehead despite the cool morning air. George's governess, Mrs. Henderson, was following a few steps behind, carrying his school books for the day's lessons. She noticed the young prince had stopped and approached him quietly. "Your Highness, your tutor is waiting in the library," she whispered softly. But George didn't move. His young mind was processing what he was seeing. He had learned about duty and service from his father and grandfather, but he was also learning about compassion from his mother. The two lessons were coming together in this moment as he watched Thomas struggle to maintain his composure. The guard's breathing had become shallow and quick. George recognized the signs because his friend at school sometimes had panic attacks before important exams. The difference was that Thomas couldn't just leave his post or ask for help. He was bound by duty to stand there, no matter how he felt. Other palace staff walked by without noticing anything unusual. To them, Thomas looked like any other guard doing his job, but George's young eyes, perhaps because they weren't yet trained to ignore such things, saw the human being behind the uniform. George made a decision that would later be talked about throughout the palace. He walked directly up to Thomas, breaking the informal rule that royals don't engage with guards on duty unless necessary. "Good morning, Thomas," George said quietly, his voice gentle and respectful. The guard's eyes widened slightly in surprise. He had been so focused on trying to control his anxiety that he hadn't noticed the young prince approaching. For a moment, he seemed unsure whether he should respond. But George's friendly demeanor made the choice easy. "Good morning, Your Highness," Thomas replied, his voice barely above a whisper. George could see that Thomas was struggling, but he also understood that directly asking about it might embarrass the guard or put him in a difficult position. Instead, the young prince did something remarkable for someone his age. He began to talk about ordinary things, creating a distraction that might help Thomas feel more normal. "I was just thinking about how long these corridors are," George said, looking around as if he were genuinely interested in the architecture. "Do you ever get tired standing here?" Thomas managed a small smile despite his discomfort. "Sometimes, Your Highness, but it's an honor to serve," George nodded thoughtfully. He could see that talking was helping Thomas breathe more normally. The conversation was giving the guard something else to focus on besides whatever was causing his distress. "My grandmother always says that the people who work here are the real heart of the palace," George continued, his words carrying a wisdom that seemed beyond his years. "She says we're only as strong as the people who choose to serve alongside us." These weren't empty words from George. He had genuinely listened when his grandmother, the Queen, spoke about leadership and service. Even at his young age, he understood that true nobility came from how you treated others, especially those who couldn't ask for anything in return. Thomas felt his breathing begin to steady. The young prince's presence, rather than adding pressure, was somehow comforting. There was something about George's genuine interest and respect that made Thomas feel seen as a person rather than just a uniformed figure. Mrs. Henderson watched this interaction with growing amazement. She had been working with the royal family for years, but she had never seen such natural compassion from someone so young. George wasn't performing or trying to impress anyone. He was simply being kind because he saw someone who needed kindness. Other staff members began to notice the unusual scene. It wasn't common for any royal to have an extended conversation with a guard on duty, let alone a 10-year-old prince. Some watched from a distance, curious about what was happening. George sensed that too much attention might make Thomas uncomfortable, so he prepared to continue his walk. But before leaving, he did something that no one expected. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small chocolate bar, one of several he had been saving from his breakfast. "I always get nervous before my lessons," George said quietly, offering the chocolate to Thomas. "My mother says chocolate helps with nerves. Maybe it will help you too." Thomas was stunned. In his 6 months at the palace, no member of the royal family had ever offered him anything, let alone something so personal and thoughtful. For a moment, he wasn't sure if he should accept it. George seemed to understand his hesitation. "Please," the young prince said simply. "One person helping another?" The simplicity and sincerity of those words broke down any formal barriers. Thomas carefully accepted the chocolate, his hands no longer trembling. "Thank you, Your Highness," Thomas said, and his voice was stronger now. "This means more than you know." George smiled, the kind of genuine smile that children give when they've done something good, without expecting anything in return. "We all need help sometimes," he said. "That's what makes us human." As George walked away with Mrs. Henderson, he didn't look back to see the effect of his actions. He didn't know that Thomas stood a little straighter, breathed a little easier, and felt a renewed sense of purpose in his duty. The young prince also didn't see the other staff members who had witnessed the exchange, their faces showing a mixture of surprise and deep respect. Mrs. Henderson, however, couldn't stop thinking about what she had just witnessed. In her years of service, she had seen many acts of royal duty and protocol, but what George had just done was something different entirely. It was leadership in its purest form, unmarked by ceremony or expectation. By the time they reached the library for George's morning lessons, word of the encounter was already beginning to spread quietly through the palace staff. Not as gossip, but as something more profound. The story was being told with the kind of reverence usually reserved for historical events. George's tutor, Mr. Whitmore, noticed that the young prince seemed particularly thoughtful during his history lesson that morning. When they discussed past monarchs and their relationships with their subjects, George asked more questions than usual about how kings and queens had shown care for ordinary people. "The best leaders," Mr. Whitmore explained, "are those who remember that their position is meant to serve others, not to elevate themselves above others." George nodded, thinking about Thomas and wondering how he was doing. The young prince didn't yet understand the full significance of what he had done, but he felt good about it. It had seemed like the natural thing to do, the right thing to do. Meanwhile, Thomas continued his shift with a new perspective. The chocolate bar remained carefully tucked in his pocket, but its presence was a constant reminder that he had been seen, acknowledged, and cared for by someone who had no obligation to notice him at all. The other guards began to notice that Thomas seemed different as the day progressed. His posture was more confident, his demeanor more relaxed. When asked about it during their brief break, Thomas simply said he'd had a good morning, but his smile suggested there was more to the story. As the day ended and the evening shift prepared to take over, Thomas couldn't help but reflect on how a simple act of kindness had changed everything. He thought about the young prince who had taken time from his important day to care about a struggling guard. It made Thomas want to be worthy of that kindness, to serve not just out of duty but out of genuine gratitude and respect. The chocolate bar had long since been eaten, but its impact would last much longer. Thomas would later say it was the moment he truly understood what it meant to serve the crown, not as a distant symbol, but as a family that cared about the people who chose to stand with them. That night, as George prepared for bed, he thought briefly about Thomas and hoped he had felt better as the day went on. The young prince had no way of knowing that his simple act of kindness had already become the talk of the palace staff, or that it would soon reach the ears of much more senior members of the royal household. News of Prince George's encounter with Thomas spread through the palace with remarkable speed, though not in the way palace gossip usually traveled. This was different. The staff members who had witnessed or heard about the young prince's kindness spoke about it with a kind of reverence that surprised even them. Sarah, one of the housekeeping staff who had seen the entire interaction, found herself telling the story to her supervisor with tears in her eyes. She had worked at the palace for 15 years and had never seen anything quite like it. It wasn't just what he did, Sarah explained to anyone who would listen. It was how he did it. Like it was the most natural thing in the world to care about someone else's feelings. The story reached Mrs. Margaret Phillips, the head of household staff, by lunchtime. Mrs. Phillips was a woman who had dedicated 30 years of her life to royal service. She had seen generations of royals come and go, had witnessed moments of great ceremony and quiet dignity. But something about this story struck her as particularly significant. Mrs. Phillips made a decision that would set in motion a series of events that none of them could have anticipated. She decided that this story needed to reach higher up in the palace hierarchy, not because Prince George had done anything wrong, but because he had done something so remarkably right. That afternoon, as Prince George attended his art lesson, completely unaware of the conversations happening throughout the palace, Mrs. Phillips requested a private meeting with Sir Edward Hartwell, the private secretary to Prince William. Sir Edward was a man known for his careful consideration and his deep understanding of royal protocol and tradition. When Mrs. Phillips finished relating the story of George's interaction with Thomas, Sir Edward sat in thoughtful silence for several moments. He was a man who measured his words carefully, especially when it came to matters involving the royal children. "You say the other staff members witnessed this?" Sir Edward asked. "Yes, sir. Several of them. They all tell the same story." The young prince saw that Thomas was struggling and took it upon himself to help, without any prompting from his governess or anyone else. Sir Edward nodded slowly. In his years of service, he had learned to recognize moments of genuine significance. This felt like one of those moments. And how did the other guards react to this? Mrs. Phillips smiled for the first time during their conversation. "That's perhaps the most remarkable part, sir." Word spread to the other guards throughout the day, and rather than seeing it as a breach of protocol, they seemed to view it as something quite extraordinary. The respect for Prince George among the staff has grown tremendously. That evening, as the royal family gathered for their private dinner, Sir Edward made the decision to speak with Prince William about his son's actions. The conversation took place after dinner, in William's private study, away from the children. William listened to the account with growing amazement and pride. As a father, he was moved by his son's natural compassion. As a future king, he understood the deeper significance of George's actions for the monarchy's relationship with those who served it. "Has anyone spoken to George about this?" William asked. "Not that I'm aware of, sir." The young prince seems to be unaware of the impact his actions have had. William considered this carefully. He remembered his own childhood in the palace, the formal distance that often existed between the royal family and the staff. His grandmother had always taught him about service and duty, but George seemed to be learning these lessons in a more natural, intuitive way. The next morning brought an unexpected turn of events. Thomas arrived for his shift, to find that word of Prince George's kindness had reached beyond the palace walls. His sergeant, a gruff but fair man named Sergeant Morrison, called him aside before he took his post. "I hear you had an interesting encounter yesterday, Thomas," Sergeant Morrison said, his tone neutral but his eyes showing curiosity. Thomas felt his stomach tighten. He wondered if he had somehow violated protocol by accepting the chocolate from Prince George. "Yes, sir. Prince George was very kind." Sergeant Morrison studied the young guard for a moment. "Kind, was he? Tell me exactly what happened." Thomas recounted the entire encounter, leaving nothing out. He explained how nervous he had been, how Prince George had noticed his distress, and how the young prince's simple act of kindness had helped him through a difficult moment. When Thomas finished his account, Sergeant Morrison was quiet for a long time. Finally, he spoke, and his words surprised Thomas completely. In my 25 years of service, I've seen a lot of interactions between the royal family and the guards. What you've described isn't just unusual, Thomas. It's remarkable. That young prince showed the kind of leadership that can't be taught in any military academy. Thomas felt a wave of relief wash over him. So I didn't do anything wrong by accepting the chocolate? Sergeant Morrison actually smiled. Something Thomas had rarely seen him do. Wrong? Son, you were part of something very right, and I want you to know that your conduct throughout has been exemplary. The fact that Prince George felt comfortable approaching you speaks well of your character. Meanwhile, Prince George was going about his normal routine, still unaware of the conversations happening around him. During his morning walk through the gardens with his younger siblings, Princess Charlotte and Prince Louis, he passed by several staff members who seemed to regard him with a new kind of warmth and respect. George noticed the change but couldn't quite understand it. The gardener, Mr. Thompson, actually stopped his work to tip his hat as the children passed by. One of the housekeeping staff, whom George didn't even know by name, smiled and nodded in a way that seemed more personal than the usual polite acknowledgement. It was Princess Charlotte who first voiced what George was wondering. "Why is everyone being so nice to you today, George?" she asked, as they walked past the rose garden. George shrugged, genuinely puzzled. "I don't know. Maybe they're just having a good day." But Charlotte, despite being younger, was perceptive. She had noticed the way the staff members looked at her brother with something approaching admiration. "It's different," she insisted. "They look at you like you did something special." George thought about this as they continued their walk. He couldn't think of anything special he had done recently. His lessons had gone well. He hadn't broken anything or caused any trouble. The only unusual thing he could remember was his conversation with Thomas the day before, but that had seemed so normal to him that he didn't think it worth mentioning. Later that morning, as George sat in the library reading, Mrs. Henderson approached him with a gentle smile. She had been thinking about yesterday's encounter all night and had made a decision about how to address it. "Your Highness," she said softly, "I wanted to tell you how proud I was of your kindness to Thomas yesterday." George looked up from his book, slightly confused. "I just talked to him. He seemed upset about something." Mrs. Henderson sat down beside him, choosing her words carefully. "Sometimes, Your Highness, the most important things we do are the things that feel natural to us. What you did for Thomas yesterday showed great kindness and wisdom." George was beginning to understand that his interaction with Thomas had been more significant than he had realized. "Did I do something wrong? Should I not have talked to him?" "Oh no, Your Highness. Quite the opposite. You did something very right. You saw that someone needed help, and you helped them in the most appropriate way possible. That's what good leaders do." George considered this. He had been learning about leadership in his history lessons, studying the great monarchs of the past and how they had ruled their kingdoms. But yesterday, with Thomas, hadn't felt like leadership in the formal sense. It had just felt like being human. "Mrs. Henderson," George said thoughtfully, "do you think being kind is part of being a good king?" The question was so direct and innocent that Mrs. Henderson felt tears prick her eyes. "I think it's the most important part, Your Highness. Anyone can give orders or wear a crown, but only a true leader can see when someone needs help and care enough to provide it." That afternoon, something unprecedented happened. Prince William made an unscheduled visit to the East Wing, where Thomas was stationed. This was unusual enough to cause a stir among the staff, but what happened next was even more remarkable. William approached Thomas directly, something that caught the young guard completely off guard. Thomas immediately snapped to attention, his training taking over despite his surprise. "At ease, Thomas," William said quietly. "I wanted to speak with you about yesterday." Thomas felt his heart racing again, but this time it was from nervousness rather than anxiety. "Yes, sir, Your Royal Highness. I understand my son George took some time to speak with you yesterday," William continued, his voice warm and approachable. "Yes, sir. Prince George was very kind." William smiled. "I want you to know that his actions yesterday made me very proud as his father." But I also want you to know that your conduct in accepting his kindness with such grace reflects very well on you and on the guard." Thomas was stunned. He had expected, at worst, to be reprimanded for the breach in protocol. At best, he had hoped the incident would be quietly ignored. He had never imagined that Prince George's father would personally thank him for being the recipient of kindness. "George has always had a compassionate nature," William continued. "But yesterday, he showed the kind of instinctive leadership that gives me great hope for the future of this monarchy. Thank you for allowing him to express that compassion." As William walked away, Thomas stood at his post with a new understanding of what it meant to serve the royal family. It wasn't just about duty and protocol. Though those remained important, it was about being part of something larger, a tradition of service that worked both ways. Word of Prince William's visit to Thomas spread even faster than the original story of George's kindness. The palace staff began to understand that they had witnessed something that went far beyond a simple act of childhood compassion. They had seen the future of the monarchy in action, and they were deeply moved by what they had seen. That evening, at the dinner table, William made a decision to speak with his son about the events of the previous day. He waited until the younger children had been excused, and it was just him, Catherine, and George remaining at the table. "George," William began carefully, "I heard about your conversation with Thomas yesterday." George looked up, still uncertain whether he was in trouble or being praised. "I know I was supposed to go straight to my lessons, but he seemed upset." Catherine, who had heard the full story from William earlier, reached over and squeezed her son's hand gently. "You're not in trouble, darling. Your father and I are very proud of what you did." "But I didn't really do anything," George protested. "I just talked to him and gave him some chocolate." William exchanged a meaningful look with Catherine. Their son's inability to see the significance of his actions only made those actions more meaningful. "Sometimes, George," William explained, "the most important things we do are the ones that feel small to us but mean everything to someone else. What you did for Thomas showed the kind of person you are, and the kind of leader you're becoming." George thought about this as he prepared for bed that night. He was beginning to understand that his actions had consequences he hadn't anticipated, that kindness could ripple outward in ways he couldn't predict. It was a lesson that would stay with him for the rest of his life. As he lay in his bed, George made a quiet decision. Tomorrow, he would make sure to say hello to Thomas again. Not because everyone was making such a big deal about it, but because it had felt good to help someone, and because Thomas had seemed like a nice person who deserved to be treated with kindness. Little did George know that his simple resolution would lead to an even more significant event the following day, one that would create a moment of such profound respect that a palace guard would step away from his post in honor of a 10-year-old prince's extraordinary character. The following morning dawned bright and clear, with golden sunlight streaming through the tall windows of Windsor Castle. Prince George woke with the same resolution he had made the night before. He would greet Thomas again, simply because it felt like the right thing to do. As George made his way through the familiar corridors toward his morning lessons, he carried with him a small, wrapped package. During breakfast, he had quietly asked Mrs. Henderson if he could have an extra muffin from the kitchen. When she asked why, he had simply said he wanted to share it with someone who had been kind to him. Mrs. Henderson, now understanding the significance of such gestures from the young prince, had personally wrapped the muffin in a clean napkin and added a small piece of fruit from the breakfast table. She said nothing about it to anyone else, but she watched George with growing admiration. As George approached the East Wing, he could see Thomas at his usual post. But something was different this morning. Thomas stood straighter, his uniform was impeccably pressed, and there was a quiet confidence about him that hadn't been there before. The struggling young guard from 2 days ago had been replaced by someone who seemed to have found his purpose. What George didn't know was that Thomas had spent the previous evening thinking deeply about the events of the past 2 days. The kindness shown by Prince George, followed by the personal acknowledgement from Prince William, had fundamentally changed how Thomas viewed his role. He was no longer just a guard going through the motions. He was a protector of something precious and meaningful. George approached Thomas with the same natural manner he had shown before, carrying the wrapped muffin casually in his hand. "Good morning, Thomas," George said with a genuine smile. "Good morning, Your Highness," Thomas replied, and his voice was strong and clear. George noticed the change immediately. "You seem much better today." "I'm glad. Thank you. Your Highness. Your kindness yesterday helped more than you know." George felt pleased but also slightly embarrassed by the gratitude. He held out the wrapped muffin. "I brought you something from breakfast. Mrs. Henderson makes sure we always have extra. And I thought you might like it." Thomas looked at the offering with surprise and deep emotion. In that moment, he understood that Prince George's kindness wasn't a one-time gesture born from pity or obligation. It was simply who the young prince was as a person. "Your Highness," Thomas said softly, "you don't need to bring me anything. Your friendship is gift enough." The word friendship hung in the air between them. It was a word that transcended the formal boundaries of their different stations, acknowledging a human connection that was both innocent and profound. George smiled at hearing himself described as Thomas's friend. "Friends help each other," he said simply. "That's what my mother always tells me." As they talked, something unexpected began to happen. Other guards along the corridor, who had heard the story of George's initial kindness and Prince William's subsequent visit, began to take notice of this second interaction. But rather than simply observing, they began to feel something they had never experienced before in their years of service. Sergeant Morrison, making his morning rounds, paused at the corner where he could observe the interaction without interrupting it. What he saw moved him in a way that surprised him. The young prince was treating Thomas not as a uniformed figure to be ignored, but as a valued member of the palace community. Other staff members also began to gather at respectful distances. Mrs. Phillips appeared from one corridor, Sarah the housekeeper from another. Word spread quickly but quietly through the nearby areas of the palace that Prince George was again showing extraordinary kindness to one of the guards. George, focused on his conversation with Thomas, was initially unaware of the growing audience. He and Thomas talked about simple things: the weather, the beautiful architecture of the castle, Thomas's hometown. It was an ordinary conversation between two people who had developed a genuine fondness for each other. But then something remarkable happened. As Prince George prepared to continue on to his lessons, he did something that no one expected. He extended his hand to Thomas for a handshake, as he might with any friend. Thomas stared at the offered hand for a moment, understanding the profound significance of the gesture. A member of the royal family was offering to shake hands with him as an equal, as a friend. The formal protocols of his training warred with the genuine emotion of the moment. Thomas made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He carefully set down his ceremonial rifle, leaning it against the wall behind him. Then, with great dignity, he removed his ceremonial gloves and reached out to shake Prince George's hand. The moment their hands met in that simple, human gesture of friendship and respect, something extraordinary happened throughout the corridor. Every guard within sight, without any command or discussion, stepped away from their posts and came to attention in a formal salute. Sergeant Morrison, tears in his eyes, was the first to move. He stepped forward from his observation point and rendered a perfect military salute, not to Prince George's royal status, but to the character he had demonstrated. One by one, every guard in the corridor followed suit. Mrs. Phillips, Sarah, and the other staff members who had witnessed this moment found themselves deeply moved. Several of the women had tears streaming down their faces. They had served the royal family for years, but they had never seen anything quite like this display of mutual respect and genuine affection. Prince George, still holding Thomas's hand, looked around at the saluting guards with wonder and confusion. He didn't understand why his simple act of friendship had prompted such a formal response. "Why is everyone saluting?" George asked Thomas quietly. Thomas, his own eyes bright with emotion, squeezed George's hand gently before releasing it. "They're not saluting your title, Your Highness. They're saluting your heart." The words were simple, but they carried a profound truth. The guards weren't responding to royal protocol or formal ceremony. They were responding to the pure, unaffected kindness of a 10-year-old boy who had seen beyond uniforms and titles to the human beings beneath them. George looked around at the faces of the guards, seeing in them not just respect, but something deeper. He saw gratitude, admiration, and a kind of hope. He was beginning to understand that leadership wasn't just about giving orders or wearing crowns. It was about making people feel valued and seen. Sergeant Morrison stepped forward and addressed Prince George directly, something that would normally never happen during such a formal moment. "Your Highness," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "In 25 years of service, I have never been more honored to serve the crown than I am at this moment." George felt overwhelmed by the intensity of the moment, but he also felt something else. A deep sense of responsibility. These people weren't just doing their jobs. They were dedicating their lives to service, and somehow, his simple acts of kindness had shown them that their service was valued and appreciated. "Thank you," George said, his young voice carrying a gravity that surprised everyone. "All of you. Thank you for taking care of my family and our home." With those words, Prince George showed that he understood the reciprocal nature of service. The guards protected the royal family. But the royal family had a responsibility to honor and care for those who served them. Thomas picked up his rifle and resumed his position, but everything had changed. He stood not just as a guard doing his duty, but as someone who had been personally acknowledged and valued by the future king. The other guards returned to their posts, but the atmosphere in the corridor was transformed. Mrs. Henderson, who had been waiting patiently during this entire exchange, approached Prince George with tears in her eyes. She had witnessed something that she knew would be remembered and talked about for years to come. "Your Highness," she said softly, "your lessons can wait a few more minutes if you'd like." But George shook his head. "No, Mrs. Henderson. Thomas has work to do, and so do I. But I'll see you tomorrow, Thomas." "I'll be here, Your Highness. Thank you for being my friend." As Prince George walked away with Mrs. Henderson, the corridor slowly returned to its normal rhythm. But everyone who had been present knew that something fundamental had shifted. The young prince had demonstrated a form of leadership that was both ancient and revolutionary. The leadership of genuine compassion and respect for others. Word of this second encounter spread even faster than the first. By lunchtime, the story had reached every corner of the palace. Staff members who hadn't been present asked for detailed accounts from those who had witnessed it. The story was told with reverence and amazement. Prince William heard about the handshake and the guard's salute while he was in a meeting with palace officials. He excused himself from the meeting and went directly to find his son. He found George in the garden, sitting under an old oak tree with a book, looking thoughtful and perhaps a little overwhelmed by the morning's events. "George," William said, sitting down beside his son. "I heard about what happened this morning." George looked up at his father with uncertain eyes. "Did I do something wrong, Papa?" "I didn't mean for all the guards to stop what they were doing." William put his arm around his son, feeling a profound pride mixed with amazement. "You didn't do anything wrong, George. You did something extraordinary. Do you understand what happened when you shook Thomas's hand?" George thought for a moment. "I think it made him happy. And the other guards seemed happy too, even though they were being very formal about it. What you did, George, was show them that you see them as people, not just as uniforms or job titles. When Thomas took off his gloves to shake your hand, he was showing you the same respect. And when the other guards saluted, they were showing their respect for the kind of leader you're becoming." George leaned against his father, processing these ideas. "It felt good, Papa. Making friends with Thomas feels good. But everyone is acting like it's such a big deal." William smiled, remembering his own childhood confusion about the significance of seemingly simple actions. "Sometimes, the most important things we do feel like the most natural things. That's what makes them genuine. What you've shown, Thomas, and all the staff, is that kindness and respect aren't just for special occasions. They're for every day." That afternoon, Thomas found himself the center of attention in a way that made him slightly uncomfortable. Fellow guards congratulated him. Staff members smiled at him warmly. And everyone seemed to want to hear his account of Prince George's friendship. But Thomas was most moved by a brief conversation he had with Sergeant Morrison during their break. "Thomas," the sergeant said, "what happened this morning wasn't just about Prince George showing kindness to you. It was about you showing the courage to accept that kindness with dignity. Not everyone would have had the presence of mind to respond as you did." Thomas considered this. "I just didn't want to disappoint him, sir. He was being so genuine that it would have felt wrong to hide behind protocol." "Exactly. And that's why every guard in that corridor saluted this morning. They were saluting both of you, his kindness and your courage to accept it appropriately." As evening approached, the palace had settled into its normal routines, but the atmosphere remained changed. There was a warmth and pride among the staff that hadn't been there before. They felt part of something special, something that went beyond duty and tradition to touch the very heart of what service could mean. That night, as the royal family gathered for dinner, George found himself the center of positive attention from his parents and grandparents, who had all heard various versions of the morning's events. The Queen herself, who had been told the story by several different people, regarded her great-grandson with a mixture of pride and hope for the future of the monarchy. "George," she said during dessert, "I understand you've been making quite an impression on the palace staff." George blushed slightly. "I just made friends with Thomas, Gangan. He's very nice." The Queen smiled, using the family nickname that George had given her years ago. "Making friends is one of the most important skills a future monarch can have. You're learning that leadership isn't about being above people, but about being among them with kindness and respect." As George prepared for bed that night, he reflected on the events of the past 3 days. He thought about Thomas, about the other guards who had saluted, about all the staff members who had seemed so moved by something that felt natural and right to him. He was beginning to understand that his actions had meaning beyond their immediate effect. He was learning that kindness could inspire others, that treating people with respect could make them feel valued and proud of their work. Most importantly, George was learning that being a prince, and someday a king, wasn't about being served by others. It was about serving others, about using his position to make people feel appreciated and cared for. As he drifted off to sleep, Prince George made another quiet resolution. Tomorrow, he would continue to be kind. Not because everyone was watching and praising him for it, but because it felt right. And perhaps, he thought, if he kept being kind, he might make more friends like Thomas. The young prince couldn't know it yet, but his simple acts of human kindness had planted seeds that would grow throughout his life and reign. He had shown everyone at the palace, from the most senior officials to the newest guards, what authentic leadership looked like. And in doing so, he had earned something that couldn't be commanded or demanded: genuine love and respect from those who would dedicate their lives to serving the crown. The story of Prince George's kind acts would be told and retold for generations, becoming part of the palace's oral history. But for George himself, it wasn't a story at all. It was simply the beginning of a lifetime of treating people with the dignity and respect that every human being deserved, regardless of their station or title. In the years to come, whenever new guards joined the palace staff, they would hear the story of the young prince who saw beyond uniforms to the people wearing them, who offered chocolate to calm nerves and shook hands in friendship. And they would understand that they were serving not just a royal family, but a tradition of mutual respect and genuine care that had been established by a 10-year-old boy who simply chose to be kind.